Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar. My name is Dr. Julio Friedman. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, where I lead the Carbon Management Research Initiative. Today, we're going to discuss a new method to assess the costs and greenhouse gas reduction potential associated with carbon removal policies, energy technology policies, deployment of innovative solutions, and investment decisions. We call this a levelized cost of carbon abatement, and we're delighted that you're here. Let me first quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you who are watching the live stream anywhere else, you may submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CGEPLive. Again, hashtag CGEPLive, and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy. With that, I am delighted to not only launch this event, but to introduce an extraordinary set of panelists and moderators. We have with us today Elizabeth Wilmot from Microsoft, Arjun Murthy from Warburg Pincus, Jules Kortenhorst from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Marissa Buchanan from JP Morgan Chase, and our moderator today is Dr. Akshat Rathi from Bloomberg News. It is my pleasure and privilege, though, first to introduce to you Senator Heitkamp, the former US Senator from North Dakota, and not only the head of Our Country Project, but also an extraordinary public servant and actor. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Julio. And I have to start out by saying how incredibly privileged I feel to be part of the work that you're doing at Columbia. And not because I'm a particularly good mathematician, I'm not, or that I'm a client scientist, I'm not, but I am a policymaker, and I have watched the challenges that policymakers have had, even those that believe that we need to do something very, very soon and very dramatic on climate, the problems that they have had in coming up with valid and acceptable public policy changes. And so the first thing I would say, this is a two-step process. The first step is to actually get to net zero. And to have public policy that universally accepts that as the goal, and then to build political relationships so that that goal doesn't get modified or changed or isn't even debatable. You take it, I like to compare all of this to what's happening right now with COVID. I mean, there isn't one person in America that should not believe that the goal in our country is to eradicate or certainly contain 100% the virus. So if we can have a goal in the United States of America to get to net zero, that would be a big step forward. Now, step two is how do we get there? And I think that one of the challenges that we've had in getting to step one is that we haven't adequately defined step two. I will tell you, representing a very carbon intensive economy here in North Dakota, whether it is our coal-fired generation industry or whether it in fact is our oil and gas industry, anytime you start mentioning climate or carbon constrained policies, what you're going to get is you're going to get a lot of economic angst. You're going to get people saying, we can't do that. Not only would it affect our jobs, but it would affect the entire economy. And it has been that economic argument that I think has been the real inhibitor of people accepting the need to get to net zero. So how does the work that Columbia is doing and that Julio and his team are doing right now, how does that affect these public policy challenges? Well, the first thing I would tell you, if you're an old farmer in North Dakota, or if you're a businessman in North Dakota, businesswoman, you're going to want to know, well, if I do that, what's going to be the cost? And is that the smartest way to do that? Is that the right way to do that? And I think we've been in this environment where the strongest lobby for net zero policies is not always the smartest economic policies. And no one has really driven that argument, which is, how much will it cost us to actually get that ton of carbon reduced compared to other options that we may have? That's why this work is so important. When Julio and I were talking about my presentation, I said we should be kind of strategy agnostic. And he goes, no, no, no. What we really need to be is we need to be fighting for those things that are the biggest bang for the buck, because those are the things that are going to drive this economy and get us where we need to go. Now, I will tell you that there is a lot of work being done right now. I think that I'm a Democrat. I've been long a supporter of looking at carbon capture and looking at strategies that would in fact reduce carbon into the atmosphere, that would provide long-term results as it relates to net zero, and yes, even eliminating through air capture some of the CO2 that has already been emitted. And so I'm not a climate denier, but I'm a pragmatist by nature. And I will tell you this, if we don't come up with pragmatic ways to talk about this issue, we will continue to have this fight about that will zigzag us back and forth, that will basically lead to, no, we're not going to do anything, no, we're going to do something really dramatic, when we need to have a consensus on what the goal is in the United States, but we also need to make sure that we are moving forward to effectively initiate and move that and to achieve that goal. So how do we do this? The good news is that looking at the political tea leaves, the younger generation is obviously much more concerned about this issue. And it is a bigger voting issue for people under the age of 40 than certainly it is for people over the age of 65. Gee, I wonder why. People under the age of 40 know that they're going to be around a lot longer. And that this needs to be tackled. And then so you see the Republican Party coming up with their own carbon plan. Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, has been particularly aggressive in trying to give his party some space here. I think you don't see you see criticism of the Green New Deal, but you don't see criticism of carbon capture strategies or different strategies that are now being adopted and talked about even within the fossil fuel industry. So that's the good news. The other bit of good news is that when you look at the fact that we need to move forward, I think that we will have a political strategy that using the kind of information that you have in this report that Julio and the folks have prepared, that need to be dumbed down for people like me. But I think it's pretty easy when you say, this is the cost and this is how much carbon we're going to remove for that cost. And you can see that, and then you can see the regional differences. You really begin to see the real opportunity to develop a regional plan, to develop a state-specific plan, to talk about an industry-specific plan. So how do we get it done? Well, I mean, I think we continue to talk about this in a political context because we need to build political support. But Julio, one of the things that I really see right now is on this panel, the interests that corporate America has, that global interests have, NGOs, everyone working together to try and achieve an outcome that will in fact address the climate needs. And so I'm thrilled about this work. I hope that it gets wide distribution, and I hope that after we're through this political season, we'll be able to utilize this work to actually achieve a result and not get the hell no or yes everything, but we make smart decisions. So thank you so much for giving me a few minutes to to speak my piece, and I know that this is going to be one of those really, really important, this research is going to be so important to achieving the results that we need to achieve, not just in our country, but globally.
Thank you so much, Senator Heitkamp. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk. I know that you have to leave soon, but since we have you for just 1 or 2 more minutes, I'd like to bring in an extraordinary journalist and a friend, Akshat Rathi from Bloomberg News. Akshat will be moderating the panel discussion later, but right now we were hoping to have just a minute or two to ask you 1 or 2 questions. If I could just ask something briefly, one of the jobs you had is you had to think very much about the public purse. You had to think about the fact that you were using taxpayer monies and that part of your job was to allocate those. What kind of information would you find valuable in doing that in a carbon or a climate context?
Exactly what's in your report. It's like, I get criticized a lot of times because I thought that we should do more robust cost benefit analysis on regulation. We should do the same thing, in my opinion, on spending. So what's the biggest bang that we can get for that taxpayer dollar? And when you do that, you build consensus, and I think you build a sense within the within the constituency, within our citizens, that we are being responsible. We're not just listening to one lobby or the other and throwing money at it. What we're doing is we're coming up with a strategy that will be fiscally responsible, but also responsible for achieving the right result. And I think people understand that this is really complicated, but they also understand it's a problem. And so if we can be fiscally responsible at the same time that we're being climate responsible, we're going to achieve amazing results.
Akshat,
Thank you,
would you like to
Senator.
add something?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for your remarks. I sit here in London, and it would be remiss of me to point out that governments here are moving much faster than the US is. But in the US, as you pointed out, businesses are moving faster than the government, which is, at least in the climate space, sort of an imbalance that hasn't existed. How do you think that affects the goal to try and get to net zero? And what can we do to take advantage of such a situation?
I think we're taking advantage right now as we look at corporate ratings, high carbon intensive kinds of emitters will have to confront those rating agencies with the potential liability as they look at it if they're not dealing with their carbon problem. I think that one of the things that I always say to my friends who say, hell no, we're not going to do it. I think that what has happened to the coal industry in the United States really illustrates the challenges that their industry may have going forward, which is the coal industry thought we're just going to deal with this as a political issue, not as a public policy issue or a climate issue. They're now on life support, with many of the major coal companies actually in bankruptcy and trying to restructure. Had I think they come to the table 20 years ago when we first started with this conversation, talking about carbon capture, talking about new technologies that could in fact get them to net zero, I think they would be further along. And I think the corporate world, especially the investing world, the investor and the bankers, are going to start asking those really tough questions, if they're not already, on why should we invest in your business if we think that the carbon costs are too high and the externality costs are too high. I want to add to that this sense that shareholders are getting very engaged in kind of corporate policies. So these things can create the momentum, along with the political activity of a younger generation, can create the momentum for naysayers in Congress to actually step up to the plate and say, we've got to come up with the solution. We've got to be part of the dialogue, or else we're going to become really an endangered species politically, because this is a huge voting issue for the youngest generation.
Outstanding. We know you have to go. Thank you again, Senator, for taking some time with us and for sharing your thoughts. You're always welcome anytime, and keep fighting the good fight.
Let me tell you, Julio, this is an amazing document. I've read about as much as what I could read and understand, but I would recommend to everyone that you circulate your introduction and your executive summary. It's very, very well done. Thank you so much for letting me be a small part of this launch.
Thank you. With that, we are going to pivot now to our presentation. After the presentation, we're then going to move back to Akshat for some short questions, and then the panel discussion. Let me pull up the presentation here. And we can start. As the senator said, and as I would encourage you anyways, please go to our website and get the full report. What you're going to see here is very much the short form of the major findings. Really what we are about here is counting to zero. We have to go from present emissions to zero emissions in a very short amount of time. And to do that, we need new tools. What we're talking about today is only one enhanced methodology of an existing methodology, but we think it's really focused on getting to zero, and that this is a new tool that you can use to measure a net zero emissions world and plan things carefully and well. A quick shout out to all of my co-authors. This was very much a team effort. Hadia Shirazi, Jahuan Fan, Emeka Ochu, Zachary Byram, and Umar Bardwaj, all of whom I believe are online now. First order of business, net zero means zero. You have to go from where we are today to nothing. It's incredibly hard. And in doing this, we have to match a construction agenda to a reduction agenda. Emissions reduction is the core activity and the core framing. And if you look at this chart, many of which you've seen before, some version of it, two simple questions. How much will this cost? And what should we do first? These are reasonable questions to ask and surprisingly hard to answer. Fundamentally, we need economic and analytical tools that are built for a net zero economy. An early attempt at this was this iconic representation, this terrific heuristic, the marginal abatement curve from McKinsey. This was first published in 2007. This is the original chart. And it really caught people's attention and showed things in a compelling way. It is also hard to legislate with this. It's not useful for a number of reasons. One of them is the numbers aren't exactly right. Based on this, if you could put a 10 euro per ton carbon tax, you would get 2.5 gigatons of abatement with nuclear. That seems like that's not right. In part, that's because this is deliberately averaged. In part, it's because there is, a static representation here, not a dynamic. But the main issue is that this approach has a broad and averaged economic sensibility about what actually gets replaced. How do the emissions reductions actually occur is hard and granular and problematic and complicated, and this chart doesn't really represent that aspect of things. It is revealing, it is helpful, but it doesn't tell you, for example, how long this takes, how any of these options interact with each other, if there's an upfront cost as opposed to a long-term cost, any of these other issues which a decision maker might care about. Slightly more useful approach is to look in hindsight. How much have we already paid? And estimate the marginal abatement costs for existing policies. We published this at our center just a couple of months ago, based on data published by Professors Gillingham and Stock at Yale and Harvard. And what you see is that we have paid enormous amounts of money in the past for abatement. For example, the Cash for Clunkers program was between $300 and $400 a ton. It's just a lot of money. And people did that for other reasons, to stimulate car industry, to reduce criteria pollutant emissions for public health and so forth. But these were all sold as climate programs. And if you don't know what you're getting for the climate benefit and how much it costs, you might very well overpay or mispay or focus on the wrong thing. So in that context, it's helpful to have a new tool, and that's what we're doing here. The levelized cost of carbon abatement is an improved tool for net zero decisions. It allows anyone to assess the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions in the shortest amount of time. The key findings of this report is that net zero is the core framework. Let's start with that. And that requires new thinking. You cannot use conventional approaches, let's say a levelized cost of electricity estimate in order to get the reductions you need. Second, levelized cost of carbon abatement is keyed to specific displacement of emissions. These are not average, these are not generic. They vary greatly by geography, by market, by technology options, by policy specifics, and most importantly, by what gets displaced. LCCA, levelized cost of carbon abatement, can serve to make rigorous apples-to-apples comparisons across policies or potential investments, across sectors, often in ways that are hard to compare in other ways, but this gives you a robust, defensible methodology to sort this stuff out. Finally, and I want to be humble here, I love this approach, I love this methodology, it's powerful, but it's only one metric or one concern that a decision maker or a policymaker or an investor might make. There are many other questions, for example, around jobs, energy security, reliability, function, justice, other things that people might need to consider. Still, it's good to have this measure so you can put these other things in some context. As a teaser, I'll come back to this at the end, we wanted to give you a quick example, and this is one looking at sustainable aviation fuels versus, say, direct air capture. And essentially, on a dollar per ton basis, today a direct air capture looks like it's cheaper than all the sustainable aviation fuels. And there is no policy on Earth today that reflects this. More to come on this topic in a couple of minutes. The fundamental math is actually pretty simple. The specifics of the assessments are not. This is at its heart a cost-benefit ratio where the costs are in the numerator and the benefits, in this case tons of CO2 reduced, are in the denominator. An LCCA, a levelized cost of carbon abatement, is always presented as dollars per ton, and it always represents a reduction. If those things aren't true, you've done the math incorrectly. It is levelized. To make it levelized, you use consistent cost terms across all of your technology and policy options, and these are discounted over time, something like a net present value calculation. There must be at the heart of an LCCA calculus a policy, investment, or transaction that reduces emissions. So for example, if you're comparing two unbuilt power plants, that's not an LCCA because you're not looking at reducing emissions. There must always be some physical reduction. This can come from efficiency, from substituting one kind of existing plant for another, for substituting one kind of fuel for another, something like that. But it actually has to be a specific physical reduction, including the shutting down of existing plants. This methodology allows you to show dynamic terms like learning-based cost reductions, rebound, supply limits, all these other things, and that's fine. What I've showed you here is the very simplest math way that you can do this. I would encourage you again to look at the full report, which shows you how you get the displacement, because the displacement in the denominator dominates these decisions. And the full math looks like this, and each one of these terms is represented like this, and the asterisk has within it a levelized calculation, so there's a lot of math in here. We're going to go through the rest of this presentation quite quickly, just so that we can show you some initial results from 4 scenarios we did. The details of these scenarios are in the report. The assumptions are in the report and in the appendices at the back. We just wanted to look at 2 simple power cases and 2 cases in hard to abate sectors. Rooftop and utility solar in California, rooftop solar in 4 states in the United States, technology options for steel, and sustainable aviation fuels. Each case has complex inputs and scenarios. Importantly, we assumed in every case that all actions, all policies, all substitutions were 100% additional. If that case were not the case, then in fact, our estimates would be underestimates and the costs would be higher. These are the results from looking at solar power in California. One market, all solar PV, same technology base, in this case, crystal wafers, and conventional module designs, the numbers from NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. What you find is that basically utility scale solar is a bargain almost everywhere in the state. Especially if you're displacing a natural gas plant, it's pretty good investment. It's less than 50 bucks a ton in most cases. Rooftop solar, not the same. Almost everywhere, even when you're displacing a natural gas plant, costs are over $100 a ton in general. Same technology, same market, different applications. It's also worth knowing that if you're displacing natural gas, you're getting the most reduction, so you get the most abatement. If you're just displacing grid, then in fact the costs are very high. And as the grid gets cleaner in 2030, those costs increase. This means policies should maximize the carbon displacement. It's not about building renewables, it's displacing gas. That gets you the reductions. In this, we also looked at the value of innovation. 1 doubling, 2 doublings of global solar production. So if we in fact had 4 times the solar panels in the world today and had all the learning by doing from them, it would result in about $120 of savings per ton, but we would still be displacing today's grid at $200 a ton, even with these incredible cost reductions. So it's not about the cost reduction, it's about the cost of displacement that is most important. Next, we looked at rooftop solar, one technology, 4 different markets and states. Each state has a different amount of solar radiation, so different amounts of generation from the same panels. Also, different grid mixes. So you displace different things in the grid. Here we looked at grid displacement, displacement of a low efficiency gas plant, and displacement of a high efficiency gas plant. And this is what we found. One technology, huge variations in costs. Again, California is looking pretty good. If you're displacing the grid, it's about $100 a ton using rooftop solar. But in fact, if you're in New Jersey, it's more like $300 a ton. And that's because different grid, different solar radiation. In fact, the best bang for your buck is in Texas. That is where you have the lowest cost in terms of abatement. Interesting, in Texas, you also get the best value for displacing the grid because that grid is so dirty. In these other states, the grid is so clean, you have to displace a low efficiency gas plant. It turns out the low efficiency gas plants are the ones that are hard to displace. And in fact, high efficiency gas plants cost even more because they're so efficient. Again, this has real policy implications that need to be understood and conscienced. Here's that number again, $200 per ton. I want you to remember that for a minute. Mostly for policymakers, they should recognize that one size doesn't fit all. One technology may not be the best pathway, or one action may not be the best pathway. You may need to do different things in different states to get the maximum CO2 reduction at the lowest cost. One example of this that we ran was the investment tax credit. It is clear that the investment tax credit has had a big impact on getting solar panels built. That's terrific. It turns out that the value of the investment tax credit was all pretty different in different places. In California, 70 bucks a ton was the value of the investment tax credit. In New Jersey, it cost 105 bucks a ton. In Texas, it was 31 bucks a ton. So bargain in Texas, not so much in New Jersey and Massachusetts. This approach also lets you figure out who pays. So the investment tax credit is generally viewed as a reduction in cost to the ratepayer. That's actually true. It also represents an increase in cost to the taxpayer, because that's money coming out of Treasury. So who pays is something that you can sort out again using this analysis. We wanted to look not just at power, which a lot of people are familiar with, but with hard to abate systems that they may not have thought as much about. Steel is an important example. We look at all production methods, and the only number I want you to take away from this slide is 71% of global production comes from blast furnaces. So it's important to understand how to reduce all of these, but the blast furnaces are where most of the emissions are. So what can you do? And here, what you see is the light blue bars are the LCCA value, and the dark blue bars are the fraction of decarbonization you get at a steel mill. And again, the numbers are all over the place. It turns out one of the cheaper technologies, which is retrofit with carbon capture, gets you actually about 40% abatement. Not bad. If you replace that steel mill with a conventional DRI furnace, you get about the same abatement, but at twice the cost. And in fact, if you tried using green hydrogen, you would get less abatement for much higher cost. If you did zero carbon electricity, $120 a ton, that cost ranges, but only 7% abatement. So you need to know how much abatement you're getting and what it costs. We also wanted to understand how that affected the cost for steel itself. We'll get to that slide in a minute. Here, what you see is that most of the sector costs more than $200 a ton. And in fact, this is a way to define formally what hard to abate means. If it costs more than $200 a ton to get more than 20% of the sector, it's hard to abate. If you look at the actual cost, though, of the steel, looks pretty different. The dark blue bars are the increased cost of steel. And so what you're looking at here is compared to a regular blast furnace, that represents about a $50 per ton of hot metal price increase. And if you don't want to go above that, these 5 options are the ones that get you the most abatement within that price range, and you can compare the prices of them, whether it's zero carbon electricity or CCS or blue hydrogen or whatever. Importantly, today policymakers are talking about this in the context of things like border tariffs. And the fact is that a border tariff will either be too small to make a change or really affect the global markets in ways that don't get the abatement because you're not focused on tons of CO2. Instead, you're focused on the cost of metal. The last thing I want to talk about is sustainable aviation fuels. And I mentioned this before, there's all kinds of fuels out there, there's all kinds of approaches. They have really different carbon footprints, each one of them. Also, these fuels can only replace 20 to 50% of the fuel that goes into a plane. You don't get 100% substitution. So trying to decarbonize this is harder than a lot of people recognize. Still, we did the analysis for you. This is the range of costs, really expensive. Generally speaking, between $350 and $1,600 a ton. And in point of fact, if you're going to pay this much money, any of these things, to get the decarbonization, you're actually better off building a 1 million ton per year direct air capture plant. This range of costs comes from the Rhodium Group's numbers published last year as a range of $1 million of 1 million ton per year operations. In this, direct air capture should reveal itself to policymakers as a compliance option. Maybe instead of complying just with sustainable aviation fuels, they can use this other measure because it's cost advantaged in many markets. To close, this is a powerful tool. It really can give you insight and do a bunch of good stuff. We very much want to see this used, and at the end of our report, we detail all the places we're going to take this analysis, and we make recommendations how the governments and how investors might use this tool in the future. With that, thank you so much for your time and attention, and we look forward to talking to you more and taking your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio.
Rafi.
All right. So I had a number of questions, but the questions in the Q&A box are piling up, and some of them are really simple and factual and fast. So I feel like it would be worth taking them. So I'm going to ask, sort of lightning fast questions to you, and then ask my question, which might take a little more time at the very end.
Sure.
A question that comes from Richard Fennelly is, what is a dollar per ton figure on LCCA that would be considered attractive?
It's the eye of the beholder, right? This is one of the things that we are humble about. Policymakers have different things they care about in different places. Me personally, if you're in $100 per ton range or lower, that's a pretty good investment. And in the European market, a lot of policies look like that. It's also the case that the European trading scheme is a whole lot less than that money. So you have to think about that through. In the United States, some states like California may be willing to pay $100 a ton. A state like Texas might not. And so what I like is less material than what a policymaker thinks they can get legislated.
Right. Another one which came up a few times, and this one is from Rhodes Stephenson, is what do you think of the drawdown data and methodology, the drawdown project, and how it might compare with what your LCCA analysis tells you are the most effective methods to cut carbon?
I think that the project drawdown is extremely helpful. It's shown some light on a bunch of really useful things. My experience in reviewing that is that a lot of the numbers in Project Drawdown actually are not in reduced emissions, but in avoided emissions. That's also important work and we got to do it, but it's not the same thing as reduced emissions or removed emissions. All of those are three different things. So the methodology that's there, I think, provides insights in the same way that the marginal abatement curve presents insights. I try to explain to people, if you're doing a financial analysis to make an investment, you look at the IRR, you look at the EBITDA, you look at the cash on hand, you look at many metrics before you make a decision. I would want any policymaker to use the drawdown numbers as well as our approach.
Another sort of interesting one, this is from Jan Dash, is whether this analysis can be used for transmission infrastructure. And we looked at sort of power plants and replacing power plants and perhaps fuels and steel plants. Those are, things that produce carbon and we know how to replace them. But how do you take into consideration a transmission infrastructure?
The answer is yes, you can. And in the math, the way that you would represent that is you have a cost. You would have to try to estimate how much abatement would be added from that new infrastructure. And that could be a transmission line or a hydrogen pipeline or anything else. And you would have to then to make an assumption about the additionality associated with that. This is something I've had to deal with over the course of my career with CO2 pipelines. You, in fact, if you build a CO2 pipeline, you get a lot of CCS projects that are new and additional just by having the infrastructure there. The same thing would be true for a transmission line, say from the Dakotas to the coasts, which could bring a lot more wind power online and displace things. You would have to make assumptions. People could challenge those assumptions, but that's the nature of the work.
All right, and just keeping to time, I am going to ask my question now, which is, it's great to have the metric. How do you make sure that people actually use it to make decisions? What is the hard work that you need to put in now to make sure that it reaches the people who can actually use it?
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to say that at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we take that engagement extremely seriously. We have already shared this with a lot of legislators so that they are aware of the methodology. We are prepared to brief people on this at their request because it's important to explain and understand these things. And of course, we're expanding our program to create a set of turnkey approaches and products that people will ultimately be able to use in the future. It is our sincere hope that this becomes as regular a transaction as something like an EBITDA calculation in financial analysis. To your question though, Akshat, the most important thing to think through is what is being displaced. That's the hardest thing to get your brain around. And when anybody does this analysis, including us, we rarely end up with a point result. We usually end up for one issue with a table in order to explain how these things actually interact. And again, that leaves us sort of both pleased with the work and ultimately a little chastened by how to take advantage of it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for answering my questions. I'm now going to move on to the panel discussion. And again, for those watching online, my name is Akshat Rathi. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. And I am here on the panel today, Marissa Buchanan, who's the head of sustainability at JP Morgan Chase, and Hules Kortenhorst, who's the CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute, Arjun Murthy, who's a senior advisor with Warburg Pincus, and Elizabeth Wilmot, who is the carbon lead at Microsoft. We're discussing the impact that the tool that Julio has developed, the levelized cost of carbon abatement, can have on the industry. And we'll move into a moderated discussion where I'm going to initially ask a sort of a question to each of the panelists to try and tell the audience both what they think of the tool, but also how it might fit into their own work. And then we'll move into asking questions from the audience. And so if you are watching on Zoom, there's a little Q&A box, and please send in your question over there. If you're watching on Twitter, the hashtag to use is CGEP Live. And you can tag in the handle Columbia U Energy to make sure that it's seen. All right, I'm going to first start with Elizabeth. At Microsoft, you have, as Senator Heitkamp was saying, have taken the lead as corporations to try and meet the challenge of a net zero world. And you've gone further because you are going to go carbon negative and extract a carbon that you've already put into the atmosphere historically. It's a massive challenge. What sort of tools do you need to actually get there?
Great. Thanks so much, Akshat. And Julio, thanks for not only the opportunity to be here, but more importantly, the amazing report and the work that you all do at the center. Back in January, Microsoft made a commitment to be carbon negative, which means that we are committed to reduce our value chain emissions by more than half by 2030, and then remove the rest, remove not only our residual emissions at that time, but then go back in time, one might say, to remove our historical emissions dating back to 1975. And so for us, that is a tapestry of different strategies and a tapestry of different incentives to really optimize reduction and removal. And so for us, that rests on, first and foremost, having a strong executive commitment supported by an internal carbon fee, which we've actually had since 2012. We've since expanded that to include now all of our value chain, supplemented by a number of different internal policies, including our supplier code of conduct, internal commitments and annualized targets to reduce and remove, and a sustainability grant program that's funded by the carbon fee. But what's really important for us, being a data science and a computer science company as we are, is being able to have this crucial data to compare and contrast strategies, such that when we're making these decisions, we're not simply throwing money at the next bright, shiny thing. And that's why I think the levelized cost of carbon abatement is really a fantastic example of a way to drive good behavioral change and smart economics as a result of any company or government's commitment to making swift reductions.
Got it. And similarly, Marissa, I'd like to bring you in now. Elizabeth has the view of being inside a company, trying to cut their own emissions first and then going negative. You have a role, and with JP Morgan having recently put out this target to be Paris aligned, which means getting to net zero by something around mid-century, in your financial portfolio, which is something that we haven't seen banks really do before. And so what sort of unknowns are you facing too when you set a challenge of this kind?
Thanks, Akshat, and thanks to Julio and the Columbia team for putting out some really impressive and critically important work. So Akshat, as you noted, recently JP Morgan announced that we are going to aim to align our financing activities in 3 sectors, specifically oil and gas, electric power, and automotive manufacturing, with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is really about driving emission reductions within the client portfolios that we bank and finance. This is certainly a challenge. We know, the world collectively today is not on a path in alignment with Paris. So the question really becomes, what more can we do within the business sector as well as within the public sector to really scale up those reductions? And I think, and especially think about, where are there opportunities for us to get significant, additional emission reductions, especially in industries where we don't have cost-effective, commercially available solutions today. I think the value of this tool, one, as Julio noted, it builds on some really valuable research that has, been done in years past, but there's always an opportunity to continue to improve and refine the tool. And for me, I think the value is that it provides both companies and investors with better data that can drive their investment and capital planning decisions. It's really important that, we think about placing our capital in sectors and opportunities that will, get us closer to the net zero goal. And, making those decisions in ways that are really informed by data, thinking about cost, but also what's feasible is critically important. So I think, this tool is a great contribution, to growing the set of tools that we have at our disposal, and I think are going to be, critically helpful for us all as we think about investing to make a real difference.
Great. And similarly, I'd bring in Arjun here because we've heard from somebody inside the company. We've heard from a finance perspective on whether they believe a company is doing what it should do and does lend it money. You as an investor make a choice about whether to first of all invest in a company at all. And so how does this tool fit into your own work? And just broadly though, what's the net zero challenge that you face as an investor?
Yeah, thank you, Akshat. And I'm going to focus my comments a little bit on my background, essentially looking at publicly traded energy equities, which I did in my career at Goldman Sachs, and really to highlight that 2019, I think, was really a key inflection point year for public markets. And I'm going to focus on North America and the US in particular, where this dual challenge of ESG and climate went from being something that kind of got talked about in some back part of the bank to really being front and center across the investment universe, companies, management teams, investors, analysts, the whole bunch. We really inflected positively. That was before the pandemic. It was before the height of the intensity of the election season. People recognized these dual challenges. I think this levelized cost of carbon abatement work that Julio's done, I am an advisory board member to the center, and it is folks like Julio and his team that make me so excited to be part of the center. I think is an outstanding framework. We all know, looking at traditional energy, there's never a it's all good or all bad type analysis. For example, I even see in the chat, if renewables are cheaper than coal in India, why don't people just do renewables? It's never black and white in any area. Look at Appalachia gas. They're low cost areas, they're high cost areas. Shale, there's low cost shale, there's low cost deep water, high cost in any region. And as an investor, that's what we're trying to assess. Where is the particular project on the cost curve? What is the market for it? And I think what Julio really contributes here, and it's going to be really important work going forward, is what are the public policy implications of the project you're investing in? Is it going to have support over the long run? Does it actually advance the societal goals, something that investors are now incorporating more explicitly in their analysis? I'll use one of Julio's examples. If that natural gas project in India is going to displace a nuclear project, not clear that actually makes sense from a carbon abatement standpoint. If it's going to replace burning biomass, as an example, probably a good project in that sense. And I think investors will start incorporating, and that you have to look project by project on the cost curve, in terms of returns, in terms of the fiscal regime. That's what this LLCA type analysis does from the carbon perspective. And I applaud Julio and the team for thinking about it on these lines, recognizing these nuances. And I think it's really critical to advancing the argument going forward. But this is now part of the vernacular of public equity markets, including here in the United States. And I think it's a very interesting development relative to years past.
Yeah. And Jules, you think about the net zero challenge from a very systemic perspective. One of the things you pointed out to me when we talked about this report was, if you look at the McKinsey chart, well, everything on the left-hand side should have been done because it's got a negative carbon price. If you're going to save money and cut emissions, we should have done it already. And yet we haven't. So this is something you've worked on for a long time, Rocky Mountain Institute has done. What are the challenges to actually make stuff that is economically sensible happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me start by saying that I really appreciate Julio's contribution to this debate with this excellent paper. But first and foremost, we have to recognize that as humanity, we are facing a planetary emergency. climate change now represents not just the biggest issue that we face as humanity, but also the most urgent issue that we face as humanity. So let's not misinterpret Julio's paper as we can do this first, and then we can look at some more data, and then we can do something else. This has to be an all of the above strategy. And if it is an all of the above strategy, then input and an understanding of what the economics of different alternatives are is obviously very helpful, but not the only answer. And that gets to your question, Akshat. Isn't it strange that although we have a whole range of carbon abatement opportunities that have been negative cost for the longest time, they haven't gotten executed on? It's because the world does not just revolve around economics. Your and my behavior is not just driven by the economy of everything we do, but also about practical realities, transaction cost, information gaps, just hassles of replacing your boiler with a heat pump, and the challenges that that represents in terms of permitting and in terms of upheaval in your house. So we have to do it all, and we have to do it all fast. And that means that understanding the economics is incredibly important. But there where economics alone is not a sufficient driver to make things happen, we have to consider other measures, other policies that may have an economic cost or an implied economic cost, but that are not economic in their nature. Building codes, regulations in general is a clear example of that. And the other thing I will mention is, if we get into a mindset of we're going to do this all and we're going to do it fast, along the lines that Senator Heitkamp laid out at the opening comments, i.e. we set ourselves a goal of being net zero by 2050, then things that may not have seemed possible on the outset suddenly become feasible. Innovation happens. Venture capital funding for new technologies gets rolled out. Entrepreneurs roll up their sleeves and do things that were hitherto deemed impossible. And I think even in this exciting methodology, that is still an area that we haven't captured yet. What is the value of breakthrough innovation when we set ourselves a very ambitious goal and thereby start driving to net zero by the middle of the century? And I think both the work that JP Morgan is doing by laying out the goal for the harder to abate sectors, and the work at Microsoft that says, and we're going to be there, net zero by the middle of the century, and we'll offset our historical emissions, puts a real marker out there, and governments, particularly here in the United States, can learn from that, should follow that.
That's great. And you sort of raised both JP Morgan and Microsoft, and I actually had follow-up questions both to Marissa and Elizabeth. So one of the things, Marissa, that Jules talked about was regulations are key to be able to make what seems economically sensible actually happen. In your goal, what are the sorts of data points that are missing, and how can regulation help you be able to get your company portfolio actually aligned with Paris goals?
Yeah, that's a great question, Akshat. So I would say two things. One is we know that we need better data. There is a lot of data out there that is currently reported by companies, but we know that we need to increase the comprehensiveness of that data and information, and we need it to come from a broader swath of companies out there. A lot of large companies are doing a significant amount of reporting, but finding ways to extend that to smaller and medium-sized companies is going to be critical as well. I think another key piece is we need long-term policy signals that are really focused on pricing carbon in many cases, but I think looking for other opportunities to reduce emissions. And we know that a price on carbon is really critical. It's also only one tool in the toolbox that can be particularly effective. And I think it's really important to think about the types of policy signals that are most effective depending upon the sector or industry you're targeting for reductions. That's really, really important. But when we made our Paris-aligned financing commitment a few weeks ago, we were very clear that the business community has an opportunity and responsibility to do more, but, climate change, given the nature of this challenge, is not something that the business community can address on its own. We really need support and leadership from our policymakers, here in the US as well as globally, and that global cooperation is going to be essential. So, I do think, the work here that Julio and team have done is going to be really important to informing that critical policy conversation that really needs to happen.
And Elizabeth, one other point that Jules mentioned was innovation is going to be key. And once you set a goal, you see more innovation happening. You've put out with Microsoft, that is part of the carbon negative strategy, that you'd like to see innovation in carbon removal, for example. And how do you spur that kind of innovation if that's what's needed, if the sort of goal to be achieved currently relies on some technologies that haven't matured?
Great question. Yeah, we see a clear need, to quote the report back to all of you, we see a clear need for a swift and profound abatement of greenhouse gas emissions. And we see that there are policies that appear effective on the surface that have little real impact. And so what we need to do is actually take a holistic view, like Marissa said, about pricing carbon, to internalize that externality. Microsoft has been a strong supporter of that in the past and continues to be so, not only based on our own internal carbon fee, but also the realization that we need to make a level playing field for the global economy as a whole. And so from Microsoft's perspective, when we even breathe a word of higher carbon removal costs internally, our internal business stakeholders interpret that as a carbon fee increase on the horizon 2 to 5 years out. And they use that as a motivation to make their reductions more deeply. So I think that there's a really nice virtuous cycle here of not only using carbon removal for its own sake, but using it as an incentive, and the price prospect of that as an incentive to drive further reductions.
Right. And Julio, you wanted to come in at this point?
Yes, and at the risk of, photobombing your panel, I wanted to just quickly follow up on how you might use LCCA analysis for an innovation challenge and an innovation agenda, like Jules and Elizabeth were just mentioning. And of course, we just wrote a big report on this, Energizing America, which we released 2 weeks ago at the center. I think about the example I gave on sustainable aviation fuels, in which you saw the LCCA prices for all those different fuels with different inputs. Well, you can make new analyses that have different inputs, and you can also make new analyses with cost reductions through innovation to set a target. And basically, if you can set a target that's achievable within 5 or 10 years, then it may be worth investing in that to get the cost low enough to clear some hurdle. And the converse is also true. You can actually look at that and say, wow, we could put $700 million into this program and still not hit a reasonable price. If that's the case, we should probably invest our money somewhere else. It's just a way to help separate sense from nonsense and think about the most virtuous way to invest for innovation or anything else. I'm going to step back out again. Thank you, everyone.
Another question, and this is, I'm taking something from the audience here, Arjun, is shareholders and investors have become, a key part of the transition. What kind of influence does activist shareholder take or have on trying to get companies to align with the Paris Agreement?
So I think historically, the only types of efforts you saw were from some of the more environmentally activist type shareholders. And I think what's really interesting to me is the conversation has shifted to mainstream investors as well. I'm sure there'll always be a feeling from environmental activists that companies should do more, can do more, and it's not my position here to debate how right or wrong that is. What I would say as an analyst is there's no question there's an interest, broadly speaking, now. And I think you're seeing more and more companies, interestingly, including in the United States, adopt Paris-aligned targets. Again, you can debate exact strategies, timing, validity, a whole bunch of different things you can debate for sure. But that's despite sometimes people feel there's not enough federal support at the exact moment. Yet we're still seeing companies wanting to move forward with Paris-aligned strategies. It speaks to, I think, how this should happen. It's really an American style of how things happen, which is going to happen bottoms up. People are going to have to want this. It can't purely be legislated from the top. There are still 1 billion people we know in the world who don't have access to energy easily. There's 2 billion more people who are going to come into the world. They're going to want some form of energy. It's up to corporations, it's up to the world to provide them the energy they need to live their lives, but hopefully to do it in as clean and environmentally responsible a manner as possible. Those sound like words from someone who has worked in the corporate world, I'm sure. All I can say is relative to years past, there is a fundamental caring of this, a valuing of this, a lower multiple on companies who don't address this, a higher multiple on companies that do, a recognition there is growth and therefore opportunities to make money. That's what companies do, that's what investors do in this space that I don't think was there historically. And that's where I am optimistic that we can meet the world's energy needs, but do it with hopefully cleaner air and less carbon emissions.
Yeah.
May I jump in on that one? Because that is a very fundamental point, right? We need the private sector to mobilize in this direction at massive scale, incredibly fast. And sending the right signal in the financial markets that the businesses that will grow, the businesses that will be successful, the businesses that therefore have a high PE multiple are those that are taking the energy transition into account and are organizing themselves in accordance with the global trend. Those companies get capitalized, have low cost of capital, get enabled to make the change. And capital is flowing away from the companies that are stuck in the old way, that don't see the point on the horizon where we're heading. And that also illustrates the role that governments still have. Both the European Green Deal and the announcement by President Xi a couple of weeks ago that China will seek to be net zero well before 2060 are very important markers on the horizon that show that is where we're heading. And if you as an investor or as a business say, well, I'm going to ignore that, I'm going to bet on the idea that Exxon can stick with its old business model, then you may end up holding a stock with a very low multiple that over the course of time loses you a lot of money.
Here's a factual question from the audience for Elizabeth. What is the carbon fee per ton in Microsoft's internal costing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy, and it's very tied to this conversation. In fact, when we first established the carbon fee in 2012, it was based on the budget we needed to invest in renewable energy and carbon offsets at the time. But that wasn't driving change. And so we actually increased it 2 years ago to $15 a ton, which was the point at which we knew our internal colleagues would be able to pay for their own renewable energy. It was based on this very similar math of what does it actually take, and so that was now we established that as an incentive for our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and that has driven the change we wanted. Now with our scope 3 carbon fee, which was instituted just this last January, we're starting lower because the data quality is poor for scope 3. I think probably across the board. And for us now, we're starting to do the hard work of figuring out what the cost of abatement is actually for these different scope 3 categories, so that we can then set the fee to be more of an appropriate incentive, and just the way the LCCA is talking about.
And do you have a number that you can share on the scope 3 carbon fee?
Yeah, we use about, I'm not sure this is public, but you'll be all the first to know our very exciting Microsoft internal workings here. It's about $5 a ton.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
we're very
another,
to be transparent about it, but it's just, I don't think we've actually published that yet.
right. And a question from Marissa. So one of the criticisms, and this has come a number of times through Q&A, is JP Morgan has had a very heavy portfolio to try and in funding fossil fuel companies. With this new goal, are you reversing some of those policies to support carbon heavy companies?
Well, this is going to be a long-term goal for us. And I think what is really important about the way that we're approaching this is that we're trying to address the challenges of climate change in a way that acknowledge the realities of our global energy system. Arjun indicated some of this earlier. You know, today, more than 80% of our energy today globally is being met by fossil energy resources. This is something that you just can't like switch off on overnight. This requires a long-term planning, investment, and I think importantly, groups like the IEA have acknowledged that a significant share of the reductions that we're going to need to achieve globally, we don't have commercially available technology to achieve those reductions yet. So this is where I think there's a lot of exciting promise. And important areas of work ahead for us collectively. Not only do we have to find ways to do more to deploy existing commercially available technologies, but actually invest capital to create those solutions. We always say at JP Morgan, the barrier is not lack of capital. There's plenty of capital out there that wants to invest in good opportunities. The challenge is in building a sustainable, scalable pipeline of opportunities where investors can actually invest their money and earn a fair risk-adjusted return. So this is where I think the research that Julio and others are doing, continuing to build upon, can really inform the development of that technology pipeline, which we so importantly need. And again, I think this is going to do a lot to address not only the supply challenge that we have when it comes to energy, but also the demand challenge. You can't just address one or the other. You have to address both of them together in a thoughtful, sustainable framework.
Great. Another question, this one for Arjun. You made the point that there is a real shift because of ESG interest among investors in moving and moving on carbon. What do you think are sort of the signals you watch out for as this market moves? And is there a risk in sort of greenwashing where investors think a company is doing the right thing and because of lack of transparency or whatever, that doesn't really happen? I mean, we've seen this in sort of green bonds where they've been lent for fossil fuel extraction, and those sorts of examples have been highlighted. How do we get through this sort of teething process?
I mean, I think it's actually a broader question. I'll try and be brief on my answer because we could probably spend a long time on it, actually. I think in terms of signals, I would share, I think Marissa and perhaps Elizabeth mentioned this about carbon pricing. I think that to me seems a very obvious step that is needed. I'm not an economist by training, but I do understand you can enact these things so they don't turn out to be regressive by dividending the money back to more negatively impacted communities. But a price on carbon would certainly be a very important signal, not just in the United States, which sometimes gets too much focus, but including in China and India, which of course are going to have the bulk of future economic growth and potential emissions growth. It's going to be very important in those areas. And it's been mentioned a few times on the need for data and transparency on the part of companies. It seems almost certain that just about all companies are going to have some version of a Paris-aligned target going forward. Maybe not all in 2020, but I would say if we're on this panel 5 years from now, and I think it'll be much sooner, I think everyone will have a Paris-aligned target. That's great, but with like all corporate targets, is it real and who's going to hit them? There's always been a positive correlation between ESG and share performance. In the oil industry, if you blew up your refineries, to use that example, you had less profits. So it was bad for the employees who might have gotten hurt. It was bad for the cost of repairing the plant. It was bad for your profit. There's always been some correlation, but it's being much more closely. There's talk about equity in the Q&A. I think some of those issues that weren't always focused on by companies, those are coming front and center. And that is more of a reaction to what happened more in the United States this summer. But I think it's a good awakening on the part of America and on the part of our companies. I think greenwashing, to what degree are offsets real or not real, as an example, I think these are going to be all important areas to monitor going forward. As Julio said, you actually have to get to net zero. The time frame you do that, the ability to meet the world's energy needs, we need to reduce energy poverty. People will always pick reliable energy over the negative externalities that sometimes come with it. They're always going to pick reliable energy first. It is no longer acceptable, though, to just stick your head in the sand and say, well, I'm just doing the energy poverty part. That's all I'm going to do. You have to have the other component to it. And so it's going to be up to investors, it's going to be up to politicians, it's going to be up to citizens to hold companies accountable for having actual real targets. Some of them are going to be ambitions today, but over time move into real targets.
Yeah. And I'm going to bring in Jules here. There's another question which sort of you touched upon, but this is from the audience. Carbon abatement is one aspect. There are so many other harmful aspects to the use of fossil fuels, particulate emissions just being one of them. How are those taken into consideration when decisions of the kind that we are talking about here in choosing a particular project? Can we actually put quantify them in like the dollar per ton or a relevant metric that they can actually be, the sort of apples to apples comparison that Julio is putting together with the LCCA analysis?
Yes, I would say that there is a complementary methodology called the social cost of carbon that would allow you to assess that comprehensive set of negative externalities associated with fossil fuels. And whereas if you are optimizing for immediate reduction in greenhouse gases, then the LCCA is a more powerful or more insightful tool if you're trying to address the comprehensive impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. The social cost of carbon might be a complementary tool. I will say then that if I go back to Arjun's point of energy poverty, the answer is then already pretty darn clear, right? Because the lowest form of power generation around the world is now from renewables. Yes, we are still building coal-fired power generation in some parts of the world, but it's based on outdated information, the wrong insights, and certainly not taking into account the massive externalities associated with coal-fired power generation. So I don't see as much of a contrast between those two. The final point I want to make, coming back to this question about greenwashing, I think there are two things that are going to relatively quickly make it very difficult for companies to avoid being accountable for their greenhouse gas emissions. The first one is that satellite data, big data, AI is going to allow us to pinpoint location-specific, real-time greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And this is not a fairy tale that is out there 20 years from now. This is actually a real-time project called Climate Trace, where RMI, together with a number of fellow civil society organizations, are putting in place the mechanisms where we'll be able to say specifically who is emitting what, where, when, and how. And then secondly, I think that the push that organizations like JP Morgan and Microsoft are making to create more transparency will also start allowing us to price the difference between high carbon and low carbon products. Green steel that is low carbon versus steel from traditional sources. Offset aviation miles versus non-offset aviation miles. And once we start putting the price on carbon really visibly into commodities and products, then we can start to address the demand side that Marissa was talking about alongside the supply side.
And Julio, you wanted to come in here.
Yes, very briefly, I wanted to share something about the social cost of carbon, which has come up in some of the questions. This was one of the very first discussions we had at our center, and myself and Noah Kaufman, who actually made social cost of carbon calculations in the Obama administration, is an extraordinary economist. We tried to work together on a joint methodology and quickly discovered that we couldn't. That the social cost of carbon is valid and important and hugely, worth taking on, but it just does a different job than what the levelized cost of carbon abatement does. And so we continue to admire each other from a distance. I love Noah's work, And I like what a social cost of carbon provides, but it is a very different tool for a different purpose than what the LCCA is.
Good. And we're coming close to the end of our time. So I'm going to ask sort of one question to each of the panelists. Keep your answers short. And I'm going to hand it over to Julio after that. But in your time and doing the work you're doing, what is the one thing that you are really looking forward to, or you sort of have the most hope from in being able to achieve the goal to get to net zero eventually? Just one thing. So let's start with Jules.
Well, I hinted at it before. I feel that the big, bold goals of the European Union and of China, laying out where we're going to head, have been critically important. And obviously that is desperately lacking in this country. So the big thing that I look forward to is new leadership from a US administration that points us in the direction of global decarbonization.
And Elizabeth?
I look forward to having more collaboration. I think having worked in climate change for 15 or so years, and knowing Jules back in the day, and all of us on the panel have worked in this space for a long time. It's just really amazing to see this issue being mainstreamed.
And Marissa?
So, I think I'm really looking forward to a lot more innovation ahead. And, to Elizabeth's point, collaboration, it's really important. We need a lot more innovation, capital investment. And I think you see a lot of interest from both the corporate and the investment, the investor sector to do that. So I think it's super promising.
Arjun?
Well, I'm going to complement what Jules said. So where Europe and China, I think it's a top-down big government approach. I am most excited that here in America, it's going to be bottoms up. It is people wanting this, it's companies wanting this. And with the help of public policy, with the help of LCCA, Julio's methodology, I think we will have a markets-oriented solution to the climate challenge. I think people are going to want it. It's not going to be a choice. People are going to want this. And that makes me optimistic. Without people wanting this, without people voting for governments, voting for supporting companies that are moving in the right direction, I don't think you get it here, but we have now made that inflection. I'm so excited about that.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the audience. The question and answer box is really full, but I could not get to all of your questions here. I hope you're able to explore the material that Julio has put out, and it'll be available on the website. But thanks again to the panelists, and I'm going to hand over to Julio now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jules. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Arjun. And of course, thank you, Akshat, for moderating this extraordinary panel. Again, I would recommend that people go to the website and find the report. We will do our best to answer additional questions in some other context. But now it is instead my privilege to introduce an extraordinary civil servant, Mr. Tim Ryder, who works as a legislative aide for Senator Chuck Schumer. Tim, welcome to our webcast. And thank you again for agreeing to come on and discuss this topic.
Of course, thank you for having me, Julio. And so as mentioned, my name is Tim Ryder. I work for Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer as his legislative aide covering climate policy. And when Julio approached me to participate in this event, he asked me to join the panel discussion. But wow, am I glad I went with the closing remarks. What an incredibly impressive group of humans with a profound breadth of knowledge. And even though we are all stuck behind computers, I think we should give them a round of applause. Truly awesome. And before that was Julio's presentation. And I have to say, anytime I have the fortune of speaking with Julio and his team, I walk away wiser because of it. And I assume that's what brought us all here today. A shared desire for the latest unbiased research made clear to us by true experts. As a policymaker, I am always on the hunt for exactly that. Fortunately, working in the Senate, I have the Congressional Research Service available to answer the myriad of questions that arise when working on policy. They are adept at providing insightful and calm assistance, and their experts have saved me on more than one occasion. But even if they had an order of magnitude or two more funding, they would not be able to provide us voracious Hill staffers with all of the answers that we seek. Because at its core, my job is to help Senator Schumer weigh the costs and benefits of the policies before him that fit within my portfolio. That means understanding the needs of our constituents, proposals' costs, its job impact, and the list goes on. But working on climate presents an added layer of complexity not found in some other policy areas. Part of our success is defined by the physical concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So while it is of paramount importance that I understand factors like the impact on New York, our nation's finances, our country's employment, it is an incomplete picture without the emission data as well. But analyzing the greenhouse gas emissions abatement potential of a swath of policies is not a service that any of the federal institutions at my fingertips currently provide. Why? Well, first and foremost, it's relatively new. The first IPCC report only came out 30 years ago. Furthermore, as you saw in Julio's presentation, this is not as simple as it may seem from the outside. And for any of you out there who have played with NEMS or Pathways or GCAM or so many others, you know how difficult it is to use these models to answer the seemingly simple questions we come across in the policy arena. And for those who haven't explored the inner workings of a climate policy model or tried to answer these questions, it is complex. And through my limited understanding of how complex it actually can be, I have developed a reverence for the modeling geniuses of our time who have allowed us to quantify the value of specific policy scenarios. That is why I depend on thoughtful New York institutions like our host, as well as so many others across the country and around the world. Working together with many think tanks, nonprofits, associations, and private companies, these benevolent institutions undertake the difficult work of publishing unbiased and well-articulated data in a form that policymakers can understand. Together, these entities provide crucial data points in the policy equation that allow me to make the best recommendation to my boss that I possibly can through their release of massive reports. It is massive reports like this incredible new document that we are discussing today, experts like those on today's panel, and institutions like our host that helped inform my work on Senator Schumer's Clean Cars for America proposal. For those who aren't familiar with it, he proposes we invest hundreds of billions of dollars to bring down the cost of zero-emission vehicles while taking gas-powered cars off the road and simultaneously investing in charging infrastructure and clean manufacturing capacity right here at home. This proposal is the result of his recognition that scientists tell us we must be carbon neutral by mid-century, and his belief that to get there, we need urgent, bold, and ambitious climate action built on a diverse coalition. Although the effort was led by my gifted colleague, Adrian Devaney, one of my tasks was to help develop the technical specifications of our proposal, and ultimately to quantify the cost, jobs impact, and emissions abatement potential of Clean Cars for America. I was our numbers guy. I began by reading reports, so many massive reports, transportation sector, light-duty vehicles, EVs, the lessons learned from the original Cash for Clunkers program. And as Senator Heitkamp mentioned, in Congress, it's our duty to be good stewards of the American taxpayer's dollar. So I wanted to be sure that we had the best data behind our proposal. That is why we called upon experts from across the spectrum to help us refine and quantify our proposal, and each brought their expertise and provided data we needed to weigh options and more perfectly calibrate our policy. I see the names of some of those experts and authors in the call today. And I know many more of you out there are researchers and report writers who might wonder, does anyone outside my academic circle read these giant documents? Well, I can tell you with certainty, I do. And I know I am not alone in the slightest. Many of my colleagues in Congress do as well. We use these reports to more completely weigh policy options, discover new policy problems to tackle or solutions to institute, and inform our conversations with our constituents, our member, and our colleagues. When we are confused, we reach out, and time again, I am amazed that so many of you respond, offering your expertise and time in an even more direct way. So to all of the modelers, report writers, researchers, and all those working to produce any number of inputs in these documents, let me say thank you. Truly and sincerely, thank you. Your work allows me to do what I do better, and for that, I am sincerely thankful. I hope you are all as excited as I am to dig into this exciting new massive report. Thank you to the whole team at Columbia for having me, Akshat for being such an incredible host, and to all of our speakers, especially Senator Heitkamp, for their wise words today. And again, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. And again, let me echo my thanks with everyone who has taken part here. In addition, I would like to give one last shout out to my co-authors, Jahuan Fan, Emeka Ochu, Amr Bardwaj, Hadia Shirazi, and Zachary Byram. To your point, Tim, you should be pleased to know that Zach, before coming to Columbia to get his master's, worked at the Congressional Research Office and was probably one of those people who gave you information that you needed to have. One last time, thank you again to all of our speakers for joining us today. Thank you to the audience for tuning in, for sending us questions and comments. I know that myself and the other panelists did our level best to answer as many questions as we could. I hope you found our answers fruitful. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. We ask you to check in then, and we'll be sending out notes on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We also invite you to the Center's next event, China, Developing Country or Superpower, and what it means for energy and climate. This will be held tomorrow, October 20th at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. For a full calendar of events, please visit the Center online. Thank you. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.